Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first interview in the series of interviews for The Racial State, which is a course that I teach at Western Sydney University. My name is Alana Lentin, and I'm here with my guest, Khadijah Diskin, who is a PhD researcher at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK and an all-round expert of race and racism and Black studies. She's absolutely amazing, and she's very kindly agreed to come to talk to us today about some recent work that she's done on the concept of whiteness and specifically white privilege. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. I know it's going to be extremely useful for our students. So the first question is, can you explain what is meant by white privilege?
So I believe that in the kind of current moment, white privilege as an analysis, as a sort of discursive tool has become incredibly popular. You tend to see pretty much everywhere people talking about white privilege, checking your privilege, all of that kind of language become popular. But fundamentally for me, the way it's been used, its popularity, its kind of utility is relatively limited. And we can only truly understand the limitations of it if we unpack and start to think about its origins as an analytical tool. And in that exploration, you find that it really wasn't an analytical tool at all. It kind of became popular because Peggy McIntosh, who was an educator and a sort of pedagogical studies scholar, who was interested in unpacking her own privilege. So it was actually a tool of deep introspection to a degree. And it was very much a very simplistic way of Peggy McIntosh trying to understand how she was located within American society, and specifically focusing on what her race offered her, but actually what her race offered her insofar as she didn't have to think about certain things. And so for me, it's useful if we actually locate it to this introspective context, but its utility as a sort of wider political project, its utility as a wider political analysis is lacking. And it's lacking because it was never intended to be a totalizing thesis. It was never intended to be a grand scheme of structural analysis. It was very much an analysis of the self. It was very much a personal analysis. It was very much something that was meant to be done to introspect on where you're located and how you understand yourself and your intersections with power. So that for me is what explains white privilege and why I'm quite apprehensive at its popularity and its use, because it very much is something that we're meant to be doing with ourselves, like checking our own privilege. You can't really check someone else's privilege.
So you've spoken a little bit about Peggy McIntosh's work and why you think the concept of white privilege might not be useful. You've spoken about the fact that it focuses on the self and really came from her own will to explore her own privileges as a white woman. But politically, out there in the world, what do you think has been the journey of white privilege, and why do you think it's had rather a more negative than a positive impact as a way of understanding whiteness as a system of power?
I think the problem lies in a sort of multifaceted way. I think, firstly, the language, the meaning that is attached to something like privilege is something that people are kind of inclined to willfully misunderstand. And it oftentimes is framed as accusation because, people don't like to think of themselves as beneficiaries. People don't like to think of themselves as having something that someone else doesn't. And so in that kind of declaration of whiteness as a privilege, there is an immediate assumption, because of the kind of quite interpersonal focus, to become defensive, to assume that, people don't know enough about you and they're assuming things about you. And actually, you've suffered lots of terrible things in your life, so you can't ever have any sort of power or any sort of, benefit. And so that's the first issue for me, is in the language. But I think the linguistic issue is not really the biggest issue. I think the reason why people are oftentimes quite nervous about it, quite scared about it, is because of what is happening. And we see this happening with a lot of kind of analytical concepts. It's something that is located to a specific context with a specific meaning and becomes abstracted and used in the kind of wider political world, wider discourse. And people always have a negative reaction to it. They always have a negative reaction, and they tend to create these systems of blame for these negative reactions, because the assumption is, people are trying to initiate a system where if you are white, you must feel guilty. If you have any sort of power or privilege, you must feel guilty. So I think that's a kind of thing that we have to be conscientious of. What happens when language gets abstracted from its context, when things that are meant to be a sort of community-based or interpersonal analysis enter the lay world without the context, without the kind of history, without the kind of work that is necessary to actually get people to a point of understanding this analysis.
Thanks. So we need to understand whiteness, and part of what we're doing in this course that we're studying together with my students here is to look at whiteness as a system of power, to look at the way in which whiteness operates as a system of possessiveness, and also to look at white supremacy as the global context, the reason for which racism exists in order to maintain this global system, which works both locally and globally. So what do you think would be a better way to analyze this ongoing problem?
So for me, I think it's very necessary for us to not shy away from complexity and not shy away from very much understanding the global kind of racial order of things. And for me, I think part of why I'm kind of resistant to privilege is, on the one side, you have people kind of negatively reacting to it. On the other side, you have its wide adaptation, wide usage, and it's kind of, you know, being claimed by sort of liberalism in a very kind of unhelpful way. And I think it's because it does this work of obscuring that when we talk about whiteness, we're talking about a historical system, we're talking about a technology, we're talking about something that is woven into every facet of our states, our nation states, and every facet of a kind of global political order. But when you make it white privilege, it becomes about individual white people. It becomes about an interpersonal kind of allocation of position instead of thinking about a structural allocation of position. And I think the thing about whiteness too, if you actually want to explore it, is that it is complex and it has a feature of contradictions. And those contradictions need to be explored. Those histories need to be explored. They need to be understood. But with the use of something like white privilege, it forecloses oftentimes on that more in-depth historical, structural, and global analysis. It becomes not the problem of a global system that has a history, but rather an individual who can change their behavior and fix racism, or change their behavior and give up their whiteness, which we know is an impossibility. An individual white person cannot give up whiteness. Whiteness is a structure, it's an organizational system, it's a political economy in and of itself. And we can only actually understand what it means to transform it if we understand the truth and the reality of it as this long history, as this political project, and as this global system that is interwoven into other facets of policy, of the juridical system, of our conception of citizenship, and even our conception of what we consider human. And I think that's where, for me, I think that greater analysis of whiteness, that greater analysis of white supremacy, sort of from the work of Charles Mills as this superstructure, is what gives us the possibilities of actually imagining different and the possibilities of understanding the totality of whiteness.
Thank you very much. If you had to give students one tip of where to start, where would you suggest?
I mean, I would suggest your work, because that was genuinely, for me, and I say this all the time, you are probably the scholar I cite and mention the absolute most, because I think your analysis of race is not just complex and well articulated, it is also truly accessible. And the way you write, I found to be incredibly useful, kind of shaping my thought and also pushing me to be able to actually understand the kind of more global political system of things. So that is, you know, why Race Still Matters is, you hear me say it all the time. It is possibly my favorite text. It's a thing I try to cite every chance that I get. And it has been a really kind of central tool for me.
Thank you very much. I'm more than honored. So thank you, Khadijah, for joining us today. I'm sure we'll speak to you again. Thank you.